In the heart of a decaying city, where streetlights flickered like dying embers, tales of a shadowy clan of vampires had taken root. People spoke of them in whisper souls who never slept, who fed on something far more haunting than blood. They lived beneath the city, hiding in the abandoned tunnels and forsaken catacombs, their existence kept quiet by centuries of secrecy and an oath to remain unseen. Yet the vampires themselves were bound by a strange, horrific hunger. Over time, their fangs had dulled and their strength waned, as though an ancient curse had begun eating away at their very nature. No longer could they sustain themselves on blood alone. Something deeper, something far darker, was needed to keep them alive. Rumors spread about the vampires' new source of vitality, the last breath of the dying. Stories were told of them haunting hospitals and nursing homes, waiting in the shadows for the final exhalations of the mortally ill. Witnesses claimed to have seen figures with pale skin and glowing eyes lingering at bedsides, leaning close as the light left patients' eyes, inhaling deeply as if drawing life itself from the air. But there was a catch. This breath, powerful as it was, only staved off the vampire's decay temporarily. It was the sigh of the unwilling, the terrified, that truly nourished them, and for that, they needed new prey people who could still scream, still beg, still breathe in fear. And so, they roamed the city at night, seeking the last panicked breaths of the unsuspecting. One such vampire, Elias, was among the youngest of his kind, and he grew restless with the clan's hidden ways. He yearned for power, to break free of this endless cycle of starvation and secrecy. He whispered of ancient rituals, forbidden practices that would let him feed on souls. Not just breaths, but his elders, fearful and cautious, forbade it. They warned him of curses, of madness, of things that even their ancient kind should never seek to awaken. Elias would not be swayed. He vanished from the clan one night, driven by his twisted ambition, slipping into the heart of the city with a purpose that shivered through the night air. Soon, rumors started circulating a figure in dark alleys, staring with eyes that glowed with a hunger far more sinister than any they had known before. People began to disappear, leaving behind nothing but a silence as heavy as the grave. And then, whispers of rebellion stirred within the vampire clan. Some longed to join Elias, to shed their ancient restrictions and pursue their darkest desires. But others knew that Elias's path led only to ruin. For something old and unspeakable was rumored to stir beneath the streets, a force that even vampires feared. They could feel it now, lurking, watching, a force that awaited the moment Elias would cross the final boundary, unlocking a nightmare that could change their kind forever. The clan knew they would soon have to make a choice, confront the rogue vampire, and risk awakening what lay below, or watch as Elias unleashed something that might doom them all. The clan sent their eldest vampire, Sable, a withered figure whose eyes glowed dimly with the weight of countless centuries, to track Elias down. Sable had been a warrior in the times when mortals still feared the night openly, before the vampires hid themselves in shadows. If anyone could withstand the darkness Elias courted, it was her. For days, she followed faint trails through the city, a cold gust in an alleyway, the shriek of a wind that bore a whisper of a last breath. Elias had grown powerful. She could feel it, like a pulse in the air, each beat drawing her closer to a place where the city's pulse was strangest, the abandoned churchyard of Street Varus. The graveyard was cloaked in an unnatural mist, one that coiled like a living thing around Sable's feet as she stepped into it. Shadows flitted along the crooked tombstones, and in the eerie silence, she heard the faintest of whispers, as if the souls of the long-buried dead were warning her away. But she pressed on, descending through crumbling stone steps hidden in the underbrush. Deeper into the darkness, the passage opened into a cavern, ancient and wide, with a ceiling lost in shadows above her. And there, at the far end, she saw Elias. He stood beside a stone altar, its surface covered in strange, writhing glyphs that seemed to shift under her gaze. His once familiar face had twisted into something she barely recognized. His eyes burned like the pits of a dying star, and his fangs gleamed as he whispered words in a language no mortal could ever know. "Ah, Sable," he said, his voice a sinister melody. "You're just in time. Elias turned and Sable's breath caught as she realized Elias had done the unthinkable. He'd found a way to capture a soul before it crossed the threshold, trapping it between life and death. This was no ordinary feeding. Elias intended to bind the woman's spirit to his own, a terrible ritual that would grant him powers beyond any vampire's imagining. Elias, stop this madness, Sable commanded, her voice trembling with ancient authority. You don't understand the forces you're tampering with. But Elias, I understand more than you ever could, Sable. The breath of the dying. It's nothing compared to what the soul can grant. Soon, I won't need to hide in the shadows or fear the dawn. I will transcend, and become something greater. A tremor ran through the cavern, as if the earth itself recoiled from Elias's words. Shadows thickened around the altar, coalescing into strange, half-formed shapes that shifted and whispered, voices echoing from realms far darker than the mortal world. Sable felt an overwhelming pressure and ancient, an earthly presence straining to reach through the veil, called by Elias's ritual. In one swift movement, Sable lunged forward, her hand reaching for the woman on the altar. But a searing pain shot through her as Elias's hand clamped around her wrist, his grip like iron. His strength was far beyond anything she had ever known. Sable, he whispered, leaning close, his voice a venomous hiss. You cannot stop what's coming. With that, he pressed his hand to the altar, and a ripple of power exploded outward. The mist turned thick and black, pouring into the chamber like ink, swallowing the walls, the floor. Sable could feel the ground quivering, as if something vast and terrible was rousing from an ancient slumber. And in that moment, just before the darkness consumed her, she heard a single voice, deep and echoing, resonate from beyond the veil. It was neither vampire nor mortal, and it spoke in a language she barely understood. Asterisk at last. I awaken. Asterisk that all went black. In the weeks that followed, people in the city whispered of tremors beneath their feet, of strange shadows creeping along the walls in the dead of night. Something was stirring, something ancient, something angry, and those who dared to wander near street. Varus's graveyard claimed they could feel its dark gaze upon them, watching, waiting. The city began to tremble under an eerie, unexplainable tension. Strange things happened in the dead of night. Streetlights flickered out without warning. Windows shattered for no reason, and shadows seemed to stretch far longer than they should. Those few brave enough to venture near street. Varus's graveyard swore they felt unseen eyes upon them, and a chilling whisper that seemed to follow them home, embedding itself in their dreams. In the weeks that followed, members of the vampire clan grew desperate. Some fled the city, hoping to escape whatever evil Elias had awakened. But others, including a handful of the oldest vampires, gathered in secret to plot against him, vowing to end his twisted ambition before it consumed them all. Whispers spread of an ancient weapon hidden deep within the city's forgotten catacombs, a relic said to be powerful enough to destroy even the oldest vampire, but to retrieve it, they would need to descend into the same darkness Elias had embraced. Sable, though weakened and scarred from her encounter with Elias, was the first to volunteer. She had seen the extent of Elias's power and knew they had little time before his new dark strength reached a point beyond their control. Despite her injuries, she was resolved to lead the others to the relic, a blade crafted centuries ago by a vampire hunter whose name had long been lost to time. Legend spoke of this blade, forged in iron and bound with the spirit of the hunter himself, who had sworn to destroy all creatures of the night. As Sable and her small band descended into the catacombs, the air grew thick and stifling. They carried torches, though their light seemed barely able to pierce the heavy darkness that pressed in around them. Shadows clung to the walls, stretching and shifting in ways that defied reason. As if something in the dark was watching their every step, they pressed on, hearts pounding, every sense heightened as they ventured deeper into the twisting, ancient passages. At last, they reached the sealed chamber. The door was carved with symbols that seemed to pulse faintly under the torchlight. Symbols they recognized as a binding spell, meant to keep whatever lay within from falling into the wrong hands. But as Sable approached, she felt a wave of cold wash over her, a warning from some ancient force. She hesitated, but the others urged her on, each desperate for a glimmer of hope. They pried the door open, revealing a room bathed in shadows. At the center stood a stone pedestal, upon which rested the blade they sought. It was dark, almost black, and pulsed faintly with an unsettling, otherworldly light. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to close in around them, as though they had stirred something old and wrathful from its slumber. Just as Sable's hand wrapped around the hilt, a sound like distant thunder echoed through the catacombs, and a low, inhuman growl filled the air. The ground trembled beneath them as the walls seemed to pulse with a heartbeat of their own. But it was too late to turn back now. Sable knew they had to act quickly. With the blade in hand, they hurried back through the twisting passages. But the catacombs no longer felt like the ones they had entered. The shadows shifted, whispering of Elias's power, taunting them with visions of his face, his eyes burning with that unholy hunger. Finally, they emerged into the open air, but something was wrong. The sky was darker than night itself, heavy with unnatural clouds, and a silence hung over the city like a shroud. They knew Elias was close, watching, waiting, and he would not be alone. As they regrouped, Sable looked at each of them, her gaze hard with determination. They would have to face him in the very heart of the city, where his power was strongest. But with the blade in her hand, she held the last hope of ending his dark reign. They made their way to the abandoned cathedral near the city's center, its doors swinging open as though welcoming them to a dark fate. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of decay and the faint glow of ghostly light. And there, standing before the altar, was Elias, his figure twisted and monstrous, a shadow of the vampire he once was. "Sable," he whispered, his voice echoing through the empty hall, tainted with the darkness he had embraced. "Come to see my ascension, have you?" But before she could reply, the ground beneath them shook violently. Shadows poured from the corners of the cathedral, swirling around Elias, who laughed as the darkness wrapped around him, feeding him, strengthening him. His voice echoed, resonating with a power beyond mortal understanding. "Tonight, this city will be mine." Sable raised the blade, its dark edge gleaming in the ghostly light. She knew that if she failed, Elias would unleash an ancient darkness upon the world, one that even the vampires would not survive. The fate of their kind rested on her shoulders, and as she moved to strike, she knew that only one of them would leave the cathedral alive. The cathedral was bathed in darkness, Elias's laughter filling the air like a thunderstorm. Sable felt the weight of centuries pressing down upon her, yet she knew she couldn't falter now. She tightened her grip on the ancient blade, its cold metal resonating with a power older than even Elias's twisted ambitions. As she stepped forward, Elias's form twisted, shifting into something monstrous. His once vampiric face now nearly unrecognizable, a mass of shadow, but there was something else in his gaze, a flicker of fear. He hadn't expected Sable to retrieve the hunter's blade. He hadn't expected her to resist him so boldly. Sable took a deep breath and whispered a silent vow to herself, and to every soul lost to Elias's dark hunger. She raised the blade high, and with a shout that echoed through the hollow cathedral, she charged. Elias lunged to meet her, his claws reaching, his form twisting and expanding like a living knife. But as he touched the blade, a scream tore from his throat, a sound not of anger, but of pure, primal fear. The blade's dark light surged, piercing through Elias's shadows. It seemed to drink in his power, unraveling the darkness that had enveloped him. He staggered back, eyes wide with disbelief as the shadows surrounding him dissolved, scattering like mist in sunlight. "No," he hissed, his voice a hoarse whisper. This isn't possible." But Sable was relentless. She pressed forward, each strike weakening him, draining his power as the blade sliced through the darkness. Elias faltered, his monstrous form shrinking, the shadows peeling away like old skin. His defiant eyes turned desperate, then pleading, and finally, he was on his knees. His true form laid bare, no longer a twisted god, but merely a frightened vampire whose ambition had led him to ruin. With one final, swift stroke, Sable drove the blade through his heart. A silence fell over the cathedral as Elias's form faded, his shadow melting into the ground until nothing remained but the faint glow of the blade. And then the darkness lifted, the sky cleared, and moonlight poured through the broken windows of the cathedral. illuminating the hall. The terrible weight that had pressed upon the city vanished, replaced by a stillness that felt like peace. Sable staggered, exhausted, but victorious. Her fellow vampires rushed to her side, their faces alight with relief and gratitude. The threat was over, and the ancient darkness Elias had courted was banished, sealed by the blade that had ended his life. For the first time in centuries, the city was free from fear. Under the pale light of dawn, Sable and her clan returned to their home, vowing to honor the peace they had fought so hard to protect. And though their existence would remain hidden in the shadows, they would remember that even in darkness, there could still be redemption. Sable stood on the rooftop of the clan's refuge, watching as the first rays of sunlight touched the city's rooftops. The weight of ages lifted from her shoulders, and for the first time in a long, long while, she allowed herself to hope.